Section 27 of The Grey Lady by Henry Seton MERRIMAN. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. Milksop. What have we made each other? The cathedral bells were calling good papists to their morning devotion as the Croonah moved into Valletta harbour. No sooner did her black prow appear between the pierheads than a score of boats left the steps, their rowers gesticulating, quarrelling, laughing among themselves with Maltese vivacity. One boat, flying the Croonah's house flag, made its way more leisurely through the still, clear water. This boat was bringing mails to the Croonah, and in the letter bag Mrs. Harrington's last missive to Luke had found its place. This letter had been posted by the well-trained footman while Eve and Fitz stood at Mrs. Harrington's bedside. Before it was stamped at the district office, the hand that wrote it was still, and it contained mischief. Even after her death, Mrs. Harrington brought trouble to the man whose life she had spoiled by her caprice. The letter ran: Dear Luke, just a line to tell you that you may bring your portmanteau straight up to Grosvenor Gardens when your ship arrives in London. I read of your fortunate escape from the cyclone and congratulate you. I dare say I shall be having a few friends to stay when you are with me, so you need not fear dullness. Yours affectionately, Marian Harrington. P.S. I always suspect you of having consciously or unconsciously possessed yourself of the affections of a young lady who shall be nameless. A word to the wise: make good use of your opportunities, for there are other aspirants in the field. A certain brilliant young naval officer not unknown to you. Moreover, his chance appears to be a good one. You must waste no more time. It happened that Luke FitzHenry was in a dangerous mood when he read this letter. He had been up half the night. The captain had been cross-grained and unreasonable. Even the mildest of us has his moments of clear-sightedness when he sees the world and the hollowness thereof. Luke saw this and more when he had read Mrs. Harrington's evil communication. He seemed to have reached the end of things, when his present life became no longer tolerable. It must be remembered that this man was passionate and very resolute. Moreover, he had been handicapped from the beginning of his life by a tendency to go wrong. He was not a good subject for ill fortune. It was his duty to go ashore with papers to be delivered at the agent's office. He delivered his papers and then he went to the cable office. He telegraphed the single word Milksop to Willie Carr in London. When he got back to the Croonah, worn out, dirty and morose, the passengers were not yet astir. He had an unsatisfactory breakfast and went to his cabin for a few hours' necessary sleep. He had given way to a great temptation, not as the weak give way on the spur of the moment with hesitation, but as a strong man, strong even in his weaknesses. He did it after mature deliberation, did it thoroughly and carefully, without the least intention of regretting it afterwards. He was desperate and driven. He could not think of life without Agatha, and he did not see why he should be called upon to do so. Ill fortune had dogged him from his childhood. He had borne it all, morosely, but without a murmur. He was going to turn at last. The Croonah must go. She was well insured, he knew that. That the cargo was fully covered against loss he could safely suppose. As to the passengers and the crew, none of them should suffer. He thought he was a clever enough sailor for that. So he laid him down in his little cabin to sleep, while the sun rose over the blue Mediterranean, while some passengers went ashore and others came on board, while the single word Milksop was spelt over a continent, and he was still sleeping when the anchor was jerked up from its muddy bed, and the watchers on pier and harbour looked their last on the grand old Croonah. A breeze was blowing out in the open, one of those bright westerly breezes that bring a breath of the Atlantic into the Mediterranean, and often make the short passage from Malta to Gibraltar the worst part of the voyage from India to the Channel. None of the passengers took any interest in the morose second officer, and few of them remarked his absence from table during the 2 days' passage. The Croonah arrived at Gibraltar after dark, took her mails and passengers on board, and proceeded down the Straits about 8 o'clock in the evening. It was late autumn, and the breeze from the cool Atlantic still hurried in over the parched lands of Africa and southern Europe. Tarifa Light was sighted and left twinkling behind. Trafalgar stared out of the darkness ahead, and in its turn was left behind. A few of the passengers had recovered their Mediterranean ill-usage sufficiently to dine in the Straits, but the Atlantic swell soon sent them below. The decks were deserted, for many of these people were returning to England after long years in India, and the first chill northern breeze they met made them shiver while it delighted them. Luke FitzHenry was on the bridge from 8 o'clock till midnight, motionless at his post, a mere navigating machine, respected and feared by all who worked with him, understood of none. When midnight came, he exchanged a few words with the first officer, and together they superintended the shaking out of the foresails before the watch went below. The wind was on the quarter, strong and steady. Almost immediately the good steamer felt the canvas, leaning gently over to leeward, adding another mile to her great speed. The sea was black, and the air seemed to be full of the sounds of waves, breaking and hissing. Ahead, the masthead and the side lights shone down on the face of the waters and lighted up an occasional white-capped wave. In the air, brisk and masterful, there was a sense of purpose and tension which sailors understand, while mere printed words cannot convey it to landsmen. It was a very dark night. "St. Vincent," said Luke tersely as he turned to leave the bridge. The first officer, a man grown old at his post, followed the direction of his junior's gaze, but some seconds elapsed before he distinguished the light twinkling feebly low down on the horizon. Luke went to his cabin and lay down on his berth, all dressed. He was due on the bridge again at 4 o'clock. The Croonah sailed by timetable, subjecting the winds and seas, as the great steamships do nowadays. Luke FitzHenry had calculated this to a minute before he telegraphed the single word "Milksop" to Willie Carr in London. He was on the bridge a few minutes before 8 bells rang and found the captain. He knew his chief's customs. He knew that this wise old sailor was in the habit of accumulating as much sleep in his brain as possible before passing Ushant Light, because he lived on the bridge when the Croonah had once turned eastward up the Channel. Whenever the captain took a night's rest, he broke it at 4 o'clock at the change of the watch. He stood muffled in a big coat over his pyjamas and exchanged a few words with his subordinates. After the first officer had gone below, Luke went to his post at the starboard end of the bridge, while the captain walked slowly backwards and forwards. They remained thus for half an hour. The ship was all quiet. The breeze had fallen a little. There was as yet no sign of daybreak towards the east. A steamer passed, showing a red light and a white masthead light. Presently the captain paused in his walk near to Luke. "Call me," he said, "when you raise the Burling light." Luke answered with a monosyllable, and the elder sailor went toward the ladder. No one had heard the order given. Luke followed him to the ladder and watched him go down into the darkness. They had sailed together 6 years in fair weather and foul. They had fought and conquered a cyclone in the bay together from that bridge. But Agatha Ingham Baker was stronger than these things. Woman is the strongest thing in a man's life. There was still no sign of daylight, no faintest gleam in the eastern sky, when the Burling light was sighted right ahead. The lookout on the forecastle did not sing out the lights on board the Croonah, but sent a companion aft to the bridge with the report. This was done for the comfort of the passengers. Luke altered the course half a point. From the wheelhouse the men could not see the light, which was hidden by the foremast. Luke went aft and looked at the patent log. His calculations were all correct. He glanced at his watch. He had to go to the wheelhouse to do this, and the binnacle light showed his face to be still and pale. He moved and had the air of a man upon whose shoulders an immense responsibility was weighing. He was going to wreck the Croonah, but he had 290 lives to save. He carefully studied the eastern sky. He did not want daylight yet. The Burling light is not a very big one, not so big, some mariners think, as it should be. It is visible 25 miles away, but Luke's knowledge told him that in thick and misty weather, such as hovers over this coast in a westerly wind, the glare of the revolving lamp could not be distinguished at a greater distance than 10 or 12 miles. The Croonah raced on, a ship full of sleeping human beings. There came a faint blue tinge into the eastern sky, a gleam over the eastern sea. The Burling light, an eye looking round into the darkness, seeming to open and shut sleepily, grew brighter and brighter. It was right ahead. It rose as they approached it until it stood right above the bowsprit. Then Luke FitzHenry changed the course. The Croonah turned her blunt prow half a point out into the Atlantic, and she raced on. She passed by Burling Island, leaving the slowly winking eye on her starboard quarter. Ahead lay the complete darkness of the north-west horizon. Luke stood at his post, his eyes hidden by his binoculars. He was studying the horizon in front of him, in front of the Croonah. There was a little lump on the horizon, like the top of a mountain sticking out of the sea. This he knew to be the rock called the Great Farilhau. Again he altered the course, still seeking the Atlantic, another quarter point to the west. He was going to pass the Great Farilhau as he had passed the Burling, within a stone's throw. This he actually did, the rugged outline of the barren rock standing out sharply against the eastern sky. There was now nothing ahead. The horizon lay before him, clear, unbroken. Luke moved a few paces. He went and stood by the engine-room telegraph. The engines throbbed merrily, but the steamer was still asleep. There was no sound but the thud of the piston rods and the whispering swirl of the water lashed by the huge screw. The Croonah raced on, her sails set, her engines working at full speed. Suddenly, Luke FitzHenry grasped the handle of the engine-room signal. He wrenched it to one side. "Stand by." Instantly, the gong answered, "Stand by. Half speed ahead." And half speed ahead it was. Luke FitzHenry was clever even in his crime. He had 300 lives to save. He stood motionless as a statue, gazing at the smooth, unbroken water in front of him. He grasped the rail and set his teeth. He stood well back with his feet firmly planted, and there was a grinding crash. The Croonah seemed to climb up into the air, then she stopped dead, and below, inside her, there was a long rumbling crash, as if all that was inside her had been cast forward in confusion. she had run on to the sunken rocks that lie northwest of the Farriel Hose. A great silence followed, and immediately the pattering of bare feet. A confused murmuring of voices rose from the saloon gangway, a buzzing sound, like that of a hive disturbed. A single voice rose in a shriek of mortal terror, and immediately there followed a chorus of confused shouts. Luke already had his lips at the speaking tube. He was telling the engineer on watch to steam ahead. He knew the danger of the Croonah slipping back into deep water and sinking. In a marvellously short time the decks were thronged with people, some standing white-faced and calm in the dim light of early morning, others mad with terror, rushing from side to side. The strange part of it was that Luke remained alone on the bridge. The captain and the other officers were busy with the passengers. The second officer remained motionless at his post. He commanded the steersman by a wave of the arm to stay at the wheel, although he knew that the Croonah would never answer her helm again. Her travelling days were done. In the dim light, now increasing momentarily, Luke FitzHenry looked down upon the wildly confused decks and saw discipline slowly assert itself. He saw the captain commanding by sheer force of individual power. He saw the quartermasters form in line across the deck and drive the passengers farther aft, leaving room to get out the boats. In a few moments, in a marvellously short space of time, the work of saving life began. A boat was lowered, the crew slipped into their places, and a certain number of lady passengers were hastily handed down the gangway. The first boat eased away, the oars were thrown out. It was off, and some of the passengers cheered. One can never tell what men, especially Englishmen, may do when they actually see death face to face. The boat was headed to the south-east, towards the Carrero do Mosteiro on Burling Island, the only possible landing place. Luke felt a touch on his arm and turned sharply. It was a quartermaster, breathless but cool. "Captain wants you, sir. I'll take the bridge." Luke turned to obey orders. "Keep her steaming, full speed ahead," he said, jerking his head toward the engine-room telegraph. "Aye, sir," the man replied. "Until the water gets to the furnaces," he added to himself, "and then we're dead men." Luke ran lightly down the iron ladder to the lower bridge, which was deserted. From thence he made his way aft to the quarter-deck. As he passed the saloon staircase, he ran against two women. One was dragging the other, or attempting to do so, towards the group of passengers huddled together amidships. "You go," the younger woman was saying, "if you want to. I will wait." Luke stopped. The elder woman was apparently wild with terror. She had not even stopped to put on a dressing gown. Her thin grey hair fluttered in the breeze. She was stout and an object of ridicule, even with death clutching at her. "Go on, mother," said the younger woman with contempt in her voice. "Agatha!" cried Luke. "You? Here?" "Yes, we came on board at Malta." End of section 27. Section 28 of The Grey Lady by Henry Seton MERRIMAN. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. The End of the Croonah. Our life is given us as a blank. Ourselves must make it, blessed or cursed. A man came running along and clutched at Luke's arm. "Captain wants you, sir. Immediate," he cried. "All right," answered Luke. "Here, take this lady and put her into a boat." Mrs. Ingham Baker was clinging to him. "Luke," she said firmly, "you must provide us with a lifeboat, a safe one. I will not stand this neglect." "Here," cried Luke to the man, "take her away." "You come along o' me, marm," said the man with a twinkle in his eye. "I'll provide ye with a lifeboat, bless your heart." And in the dim light of the saloon stairhead lamp, Luke and Agatha were left facing each other. "Why did you not let me know you were coming?" he asked sharply. He looked round with haggard eyes. They were quite alone. "I had no time. We just caught the boat by an hour." She was singularly quiet. Both of them seemed to forget that every moment lost increased the danger of their position. "Why did you come?" he asked. She looked at him, and there was that in her eyes that makes men mad. "Because I could not stay away from you." His breath came sharply with a catch. For a few moments they forgot such things as life and death. They did more. They defied death, for surely such love as this is stronger than the mere end of life. Again it was the possibility of something good and something strong that lurked hidden behind the worldliness of Agatha Ingham Baker and Luke FitzHenry. Of all men, alone had the power of bringing that possibility to the surface. All around them the wind moaned and shrieked through the rigging. The waves beating against the sheer side of the doomed Croonah filled the air with a sound of great foreboding, the deep voice of an elemental power that knows no mercy. Within 20 feet of them, men and women were struggling like dumb and driven animals for bare life, shouting, quarrelling over a paltry precedence of a minute or so in going to the boats, within 100 yards of them, out over the dark waters. Agatha's mother, thrown from an overturned boat, was struggling her last struggle, with her silly old face turned indignantly up to heaven. But they saw none of these things. All the good men were wanted for the boats, and the captain, with 2 officers only and a few stewards, defended the gangway against the rush of the panic-stricken native crew. "FitzHenry! FitzHenry!" the old captain shouted. "For God's sake, come here!" For Luke alone was dreaded by the Lascars. But Luke and Agatha heeded nothing. These people, these lives, were nothing to them, for a passionate love is the acme of selfishness. They heard the sounds, however. They heard the captain calling for the man who had never failed him. "I wrecked her for you," said Luke in Agatha's hungry ears. "I did it all for you." And at last the woman's vanity was satisfied. It was thrown a sop that would suffice for its eternal greed. Luke had done this thing for her. She was quick enough to guess how and why, for she knew Willie Carr. She knew that good ships are thrown away for money's sake. The Croonah had been thrown away for her sake. The Croonah, the patient, obedient servant to Luke's slightest word, almost an animal in its mechanical intelligence, filling that place in the sailor's heart that some men reserve for their horses and others for their wives. Women have been jealous of a ship before now. Eve was jealous of the Terrific. Agatha had always been jealous of the Croonah. And now the ship had been thrown away for her. And with his ship, Luke had cast away his unrivalled reputation as a seaman, his honour as a gentleman, his conscience. He was a criminal, a thief, a murderer for Agatha's sake. She, true to her school, to her generation, to her training, was proud of it, for she was one of those unhappy women who will not have their lovers love honour more. There was a sudden roar far down in the bowels of the vessel, and immediately volumes of steam issued from every skylight. The inrushing sea had broken down the bulkheads. The water had reached the engine rooms. In an instant Luke was alive to the danger, the good sailor that was within the man, all awake. His trained ears and the tread of his feet on the deck told him that the screw was still. "Come," he cried to Agatha. "You must get away in the next boat." But Agatha resisted his arm. That which had hitherto been mere pertness in her manner and carriage had suddenly grown into a strong determination. The woman was cool and fearless. "Not without you," she answered. "I will not leave the ship until you do." "I must stay till the last," he said. She looked at him with a little smile, for women love courage, though it sometimes frightens them. She never dreamt of danger to either of them. Her trust in Luke was all sufficient, without reserve, without hesitation. "Then I will stay too." For a moment his iron nerve, a nerve which had deliberately planned all this destruction, wavered. "Why did you not let me know you were coming?" he asked desperately. "I had no time," she answered with a singular shortness, for she could not tell him that a letter from Mrs. Harrington to her mother, the companion to that received by Luke at Valetta, had brought about this sudden decision. She could not tell him that, egged on by a transparent hint from Mrs. Harrington that Luke was to be her heir, she and her mother had taken the first boat to Malta, that she had deliberately planned to marry him for the money that was to be his. Such a confession was impossible at that time. With his arms still round her, the mere thought of it nauseated her. For a moment she saw herself as others had seen her, a punishment which for some women is quite sufficient. At this moment a man came running along the deck, the same quartermaster who had taken charge of Mrs. Ingham Baker. He was a man of no nerves whatever, and of considerable humour. "Any more ladies?" he was shouting as he ran. "Any more for the shore?" He laughed at his own conceit as he ran, the same fearless laugh with which he sent Mrs. Ingham Baker down the gangway to her death. He paused, saw Luke and Agatha standing together beneath the lamp. "Captain's calling you like hell," he cried. "Engine room's full. The old ship's got it this time, sir." "All right, I know," answered Luke curtly, and the man ran on, shouting as he went. At this moment the Croonah gave a shiver, and Luke looked around hastily. He ran to the rail and looked over with a quick sailor's glance fore and aft. He turned towards Agatha again, but before he could reach her the steamer gave a lurch over to starboard. The deck seemed to rise between them. For a moment Agatha stood above him. Then she half ran, half fell down the short, steep incline into his arms. Luke was ready for her, with one foot against the rail, for the deck was at an angle of 30 and more. No one could stand on it. He caught her deftly, and the breeze whirling round the deck house blew her long hair across his face. She never changed colour. There was the nucleus of a good and strong woman somewhere in Agatha Ingham Baker. She clung to her lover's arms and watched his face with a faith that nothing could shake. Thus they stood during 3 eternal seconds, while the Croonah seemed to hesitate, poised on the brink. Then the great steamer slowly slid backwards, turning a little as she did so. There was a sickening sound of gurgling water. The Croonah was afloat, but only for a few seconds. There was no time to lower another boat, and all on board knew it. There were not many remaining, for the passengers had all left the ship, the stokers, the engineers. Amidships the captain stood, surrounded by his officers and a few European sailors, faithful to the end. They had only one boat left, and that was forward, half under water, out of the question. So they stood and waited for the ship to sink beneath them. In the distance, on the rough sea, now grey in the light of a sullen dawn, 2 boats were approaching, having landed their human freight on Burling Island. "Now, my lads," cried the captain, "if any of you are feeling like going overboard, over you go." One man slowly took off his coat. He stooped down and unlaced his boots, while the others watched him. It seemed to take him hours. The bows of the great steamer were almost buried in the broken seas. Her stern was raised high in the air, showing the screw and the rudder. The man who preferred to swim for it looked round with a strange smile into the quiet, rough faces of his undismayed companions. It seemed to be merely a choice of deaths. "Well, mates," he said, "so long." He dived overboard and swam slowly away. Luke watched him speculatively. He knew that had he been alone he could have saved himself quite easily. With Agatha his chances were less certain. Agatha it was who had spoilt his careful calculation. Without conceit, for he was a stubbornly self-depreciating man. He knew that his absence from his captain's side had just made the difference, the little difference between life and death to 20 or 30 people. Had he been beside the captain and the other officers, the native crew would have worked quietly and intrepidly. There would have been time for all hands to leave the Croonah before she slipped back into deep water. The great steamer rolled slowly from side to side, like a helpless dumb animal in death agony. But she never righted herself. Her decks were never level. At length she gave a roll to leeward and failed to recover herself. From some air shaft there came a ceaseless whistle, deep and sonorous, like the emission of air from the bunghole of a beer barrel. The engines were quite still. Even the steam had ceased to rise. Luke stood holding Agatha with one arm. He was watching the two boats making their way through the choppy sea towards them, and Agatha was watching his face. The Croonah was now lying right over on her beam ends. Luke was standing on the wire network of the rail. Suddenly he threw himself backwards, and as they fell through space, Agatha heard the captain's voice quite distinctly, as from the silence of another world. "She's going!" he cried. They struck the water together, Luke undermost as he had intended. Agatha shut her eyes and clung to him. They seemed to go down and down. Then suddenly she heard Luke's voice. "Take a breath," he gasped, short and sharp. His voice was singularly stern. With his disengaged hand he put her hair from her face. She opened her eyes and saw him smiling at her. She saw a huge piece of wreckage poised on the edge of a wave over his head. She saw it fall. She felt the shock of it. Luke's arm lost its hold. He rolled over feebly in the water, the blood running down his face, a sudden sense of sleep in his brain. He awoke again to find himself swimming mechanically, and opened his eyes. Close to him something white was floating half under water. Spread out over the surface of the wave, Agatha's long hair rose and fell like seaweed, almost within his grasp. It was like a horrible nightmare. He tried to reach it, but his arms were powerless. He could not make an inch of progress. He could only keep himself afloat. Agatha's face was under water. On the rise of a wave he saw her little bare foot. It was quite still. He knew that she was dead, and the blessed sleepiness took him again, dragging him down. So the last of the Croonah was her good name, written large on a yellow telegram form, nailed to the panel of the room technically known as the Chamber of Horrors at Lloyd's. Around this telegram a group of grave-faced men stood in silence, or with muttered words of surprise. "The Croonah!" they said, "the Croonah!" as if a pillar of their faith had fallen. For once no one had a theory, No carpet mariner could explain this thing. Against the jamb of the window behind them all, Willie Carr stood leaning. "Done anything on her?" someone asked him. "Yes, bad luck," he answered. "Had friends on her too." It was a long and expansive telegram, giving the list of the lost, 29 in all, and among the names were mentioned Mrs. Ingham Baker and her daughter. "Ship in charge of second officer," said the telegram, and lower down at the foot of the fatal list, "Second officer picked up unconscious, doing well." Suddenly Willie Carr moved, and turning his back somewhat hastily, looked out of the window. Fitz had just come into the dreary, fateful little room, conducted thither by the Admiralty agent. He read the telegram carefully from beginning to end. "Luke on the Burlings," he muttered as he turned to go. "Luke! I can't understand it. He must have been mad." And after all, Fitz only spoke the truth, but it was a madness to which we are all subject. End of section 28. Section 29 of The Grey Lady by Henry Seton MERRIMAN. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. At Derraha Again. There is no statute so sublime as love's in all the world, and e'en to kiss the pedestal is still a better bliss than all ambitions. 3 years later, Eve was sitting on the terrace of the Casa Derraha. It was late autumn, and we who live in northern latitudes do not quite realise what the autumn of southern Europe is. Artists and others interested in the beauties of nature love a dry summer for the autumn that is sure to follow it. In Spain and in the islands of the Mediterranean, every summer is dry, and every autumn is beautiful. The Casa Derraha has not changed in any way. Nothing changes in the Balearics. The same soft southern odours creep up from the valley to battle with the strong resinous scent of the pines that crown the mountains. Eve had been a year in Derraha, the whole of her married life. The Count de Lloseta placed the house at their disposal for the honeymoon. Fitz and she came to stay a month. They had remained 12. It is so often in Majorca. A number of Spaniards came 600 years ago. 9 families. The 9 names are there today. Fitz had taken Derraha on the Minorcan Rotas lease, so the old valley, the old house, was his. Eve was not alone on the terrace, for a certain small gentleman called Henry Cyprian FitzHenry, a prospective sailor, lay in a pink and perfect slumber on her lap. Henry Cyprian fully appreciated the Valley of Repose. Eve was reading a letter, a lamentable scrawl, by the way, obviously the work of a hand little used to the pen. "My dearie," the letter ran, and it bore the address Malabar Cottage, Somarsh, Suffolk. "My dearie, please thank your good husband for his letter to me announcing the birth of your son. I hope the little man is doing well. Make a sailor of him. Being one myself, I have had the opportunity of noticing seafaring men under different circumstances, and I have never had an occasion to be ashamed of a shipmate, only excepting when he was drunk, which is human, so to speak. Thanking the captain kindly for his inquiries, I have to advise that all is going well at Malabar Cottage. The cottage keeps taut and staunch, and now that my old shipmate Creary has joined me, we keep to the weather side of the butcher's bill without any difficulty. We pull along on an even keel wonderfully well, Creary being a good-natured man, and as pleasant a shipmate as one could wish. He has brought his bits of things with him, and alongside of mine they make a homely look. I miss your voice about the house, and sometimes I feel a bit lonely. But being a rough seafaring man, I know that Malabar Cottage was hardly fit for a lady like yourself. The Count de Lloseta has twice been down to see me, sitting affable down to our bit of lunch with us and making Creary laugh till he choked. I don't rightly understand how it was that the Count and your good husband, the Captain, R.N., fixed up my money affairs, getting so much of it back from Merton's, while others haven't had a halfpenny. I asked the Count to explain, which he did at some length. But I didn't rightly understand it, never having had a good head for figures, though I could always work out my sums near enough to fix her positions on the chart at midday. I take it that Mr. Lloseta has got a gift for financials. Leastwise, he pays me my money most regular, and last time there was £2 more. I'm sure I ought to feel thankful that I have such good friends, and people too, so much above me. I understand that the Count de Lloseta is going out to Majorca this autumn. He is a good man. Your affectionate uncle, William J. Bontnor, Master. Eve read this effusion with a queer little smile which had no mirth in it. She folded the letter carefully and laid it aside for her husband to see when he returned. Then she fell into a reverie, looking down over the great silent valley that lay between her and the sea. She had been out into the world and had come back to Daraha again. In the world she had had a somewhat singular experience. She had never loved a woman. She had never known a woman's love. One man after another had come into her life, passing across the field of her mental vision when it was most susceptible to impression, each influencing her life in his own way, each loving her in his own way, each claiming her love. Here was a woman, the mother of a boy, whose every thought had been formed by men, whose knowledge had been acquired from men, whose world was a world of men. She would not have known what to do with a daughter, so fate had sent her a son. From the Caballero Challoner to Fitz, from Fitz to Captain Bontnor, from Captain Bontnor to John Craik, and from Craik back to Fitz. This, with Cipriani de Lloseta ever coming and going, in and out, had been Eve Fitzhenry's life. These men had only taught her to be a woman, as men ever do, but from them she had acquired the broader way of taking life, the larger way of thinking, which promised well for Henry Cyprian lying asleep on her lap. She was thinking of these men for all they had taught her, of all she had learnt from them without their knowing it, when one of them came to her. Fitz had dismounted in the patio and came walking somewhat stiffly through to the terrace. He had been out all day on a distant part of the Deraha property, for he combined the farmer and the sailor. He had applied for a year's leave after having served his country for 15. The year had run into 15 months, and there was talk of the time when he should go to sea no longer. Fitz had changed little. The cloud, however, that had formerly hung, as it were, in his eyes, had vanished. Eve had driven it away, slowly and surely. Perhaps Henry Cyprian had something to do in the matter also, by pushing his Uncle Luke out of the place he had hitherto occupied in Fitz's heart. Luke had voluntarily relinquished the place to a certain degree. He had left England 3 years before to seek his fortune in other seas, and fortune had come to him as she often does when she is sought half-heartedly. Luke commanded one of the finest warships afloat, but she sailed under the Chilean flag. "Letters," said Fitz. Eve smiled and handed him Captain Bontnor's epistle. She watched his face as he read. She had a trick of watching her husband's face. This was a hopelessly taciturn man, but Eve seemed to understand him. There was another letter unopened and addressed to Fitz. He took it up and opened it leisurely, after the manner of one who has all he wants and looks for nothing by post. Eve saw his face brighten with surprise. He read the letter through and then he handed it to her. "Your setter," he said, "is coming. He is in Barcelona." Eve read the letter. She leant back in her deep chair with a pensiveness, a faint suggestion of weariness bespeaking the end of a convalescence, which was perhaps climatic. "I have never understood the Count," she said. "There are so many people one does not understand." She broke off with a little laugh, half impatient. "Yes," said her husband quietly. "Whom are you thinking of?" "Agatha." Fitz was gazing at the fine quartz gravel beneath his feet. "Agatha cared for Luke," he said. A faint flicker of anxiety passed across Eve's eyes. The mention of Luke's name always brought it. She had never seen this twin brother, this shadow, as it were, of Fitz's life, and it had been slowly borne in upon her. Perhaps Henry Cyprian had taught her that there is a tie between twins which no man can gauge nor tell whither it may lead. "Yes," she said quietly, "I know." "How do you know? Did she tell you?" Eve smiled. "No, but I knew long ago. I do not think she was good, Fitz, but that was good in her, quite good. People say that it sometimes saves men. It often saves women. I think it is better for a girl to have no mother at all than to have a foolish mother. Much better. I am sure of it." "Women like Mrs. Ingham Baker," said Fitz gruffly, "do more harm in the world than women who are merely bad. She made Agatha what she was, and Agatha made Luke throw away the Croonah." "But the court decided that it was an unusual current," said Eve, who had followed every word of the official inquiry. Fitz shrugged his shoulders. "He threw the ship away," he said. "Sailors like Luke do not get wrecked on the Burlings." Eve did not pursue the subject, for this was the shadow on her happiness. It has been ruled that we are not to be quite happy here, and those are happiest who have a shadow that comes from outside, from elsewhere than from themselves or their own love. Eve, womanlike, had thought of these things, analysing them as women do, and she recognised the shadow frankly. She was too intelligent, too far-sighted to expect perfect bliss, but she knew that she had as near an approach to it as is offered for human delectation, neutralised as it was by that vague regret which is only the reflection of the active sorrows of others. Fitz had handed the Count's letter to his wife. She read it slowly and allowed it to drop. As it fluttered to her lap, she caught sight of some writing on the back. "Did you see the postscript?" she asked. "No." She turned the letter and read aloud. "I saw Craik just before I left. He was, I think, in better health. His mind is much too brilliant, his brain is too active, his humour too keen to be that of a sick man. When I told him your good news, he quite forgot to be rheumatic. 'Glad to hear it, glad to hear it,' he said. 'She was much too good to be a mere writing woman.' By the way, I imagine Eve never learnt that all the Spanish articles, except the first, passed through my hands as well as Craik's before publication. I knew who wrote them, and am still one of their profoundest admirers. But, like John Craik, I am well content that the gifted author should turn her attention to other things, notably to my godson, to whom salutations. Did either of you ever meet young Lord Seahampton, an excellent fellow, with the appearance of a cleanly groom and the heart of a true knight? He was killed while riding a steeplechase last week. I regret him deeply. He was one of my few friends." Eve laid the letter down with a little sigh, a species of sigh which she reserved for Cipriani de Lloseta. "He is a 19th century Quixote," she said. "No one ever knows what good he may be doing." Then they fell to talking of this man, of what he had done and what he had left undone. They guessed at what he had suffered, and of the suffering which he had spared others they knew a little, but of his own feelings they were ignorant. His motives they only knew in part. His life had been lived out to a certain extent before them, but they knew nothing of it. It was a mere superficies without perspective, and Eve, womanlike, wanted to put a background to it. "But why?" she persisted from the height of her own happiness, which had apparently been so easy to reach. "Why does he not come and live at Lloseta, instead of in the gloomy palace in the Calle de la Paz?" "His life is all wise," answered Fitz. "It is one big note of interrogation. He said that some day he would tell us. No doubt he will." "Yes, perhaps so." Eve reflected, and again she indulged in a short sigh. "And after he has told us, there will be nothing to be done. That is the worst of it. There will be nothing to be done, Fitz." "There never has been anything to be done," replied Fitz slowly, as was his wont. "That has been the keynote of his life as long as I have known him. If there had been anything to do, you may be sure that de Lloseta would have done it." Eve was bending over the small beginnings of a man lying supine on her knees. She drew Henry Cyprian's wraps closer around him, preparatory to taking him indoors. "Then his is surely the saddest life imaginable," she said. End of section 29. Section 30 of The Grey Lady by Henry Seton Merriman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. The Count's Story. And yet I know that tears lie deep in all I do. The pine forests on the mountain tops were beginning to gather the darkness as the Count de Lloseta rode up the last slope to the Casa de Raja. The sun had just set behind the rocky land that hides Miramar from de Raja. A stillness seemed to be creeping down from the mountain to the valley. The wind had gone down with the sun. The Count rode alone beneath the gloom of the maritime pines, which grow to their finest European stature on the northern slope of de Raja. He had been in the saddle all day, but Cipriani de Lloseta was a Spaniard, and a Spaniard is a different man when he has thrown his leg across a horse. The suave indolence of manner seems to vanish. The courtly indifference, the sloth and contemplativeness which stands as a bar between our northern nature and the peninsular habit. De Lloseta was a fine horseman, even in Spain, the nation of finest horsemen in the world. Also, he was on Majorcan soil again. He had landed at Palma that morning from the Barcelona steamer, and he had found Fitz awaiting him with a servant and a led horse on the quay. There was a strangely excited gleam in de Lloseta's dark eyes, which Fitz did not fail to notice. The Count looked around over the dark, wild faces of his countrymen and met no glance of recognition, for he had been absent 40 years. Then he raised his eyes to the old city towering on the hillside above them, the city that has not changed these 600 years, and he smiled a wan smile. "I have brought a horse for you," said Fitz, "either to ride back to De Raja with me now, or to take you to Lloseta, should you care to go direct there. Eve has packed up some lunch for you in the saddle-bag, if you think of going to Lloseta first." The Count nodded. "Yes," he said, "that is like Eve. She would think of such things." He went up to the horse, patted it, measured the length of the stirrup leather, and then turned to Fitz. "I will go to Lloseta," he said. "It is only natural after 40 years. I will be with you by 7 o'clock tonight at D'Erraha." Fitz did not offer to accompany him, and Cipriani de Lloseta rode that strange ride alone, unknown, an outcast in his own land. He rode through the most fertile valley in the world, of which every tree was dear to him, and no man knew his thoughts. The labourers in the fields, men and women, brown, sunburnt, half Moorish, wholly simple and natural, paused in their toil and looked wonderingly at the lonely horseman. The patient mules walking their ceaseless round at the Moorish wells blinked lazily at him. The eagles of Lloseta swept slowly round in a great circle far above the old castle, as they had swept in his childhood, and he looked up at them with his strange, patient smile. He pushed the great olive wood gate open and passed into the terraced garden, all overgrown, neglected, mournful. It was a strange home-coming, with no one near to see. He spent the whole day at Lloseta engaged in the very practical work of employing men to labour at the garden and in the house. It was, he said, his intention to come back to his possession, as these Majorcan country houses are called, to inhabit it the larger part of the year, and to pass the remaining winter months at his palace in Palma. In the afternoon he mounted his horse, and in the evening, as has been said, he reached D'Erraha. A servant must have been watching his approach, for the large door was thrown open and he rode into the patio. Fitz was here to welcome him, and behind him Eve, with Henry Cyprian in her arms. No one spoke. It was rather singular. The Count dismounted. He took off his hat and held it in the Spanish mode in his hand while he shook hands with Fitz and Eve. He looked round the patio. He noted the old marble well, yellow with stupendous age, the orange trees clustering over it, the palms and the banana trees. Then he smiled at Eve. "After many years," he said. There was a little pause. "I should have wished to see your father," he said, "amidst these surroundings." Eve gave a little nod. From long association with men, she had learnt a manlike reticence. She moved a little towards the open archway leading through to the terrace. "We have some tea," she said, "waiting for you. Will you come to the terrace?" He followed her while the servant led the tired horse away. They sat at the northern end of the terrace, where the garden chairs always stood, and before, beneath, all around them rose and fell the finest of all the fine Majorcan scenery which only Sardinia can rival in Europe. Eve poured out his tea, which he drank, and set the cup aside. They all knew that the time had come for the Count de Lloseta to tell his story, to redeem the promise made to Eve and Fitz long ago, before they were married. Cipriani de Lloseta leant back in his deep garden chair, nursing one booted leg over the other. He was dusty and travel-stained, but the natural hardiness of his frame seemed to be more apparent than ever in his native land, on his native mountains. "My poor little tale," he said. "You will have it?" "Yes," said Eve, and Fitz nodded. Cipriani de Lloseta did not look at them, but down into the gathering blue of the valley beneath them. His quiet, patient eyes never turned elsewhere during his narrative, as if he were telling the story to the valley and the hills. "When I was quite a young man everything was too prosperous with me. I was rich. I had health and liberty and many friends. Life was altogether too simple and easy for me. Before I was 21 I met my dear Rosa and fell in love with her. Here again it was too easy, too convenient. Fate is cruellest when she is too kind. The parents wished it. The two families were equally old, equally rich, and lastly, Rosa was kind enough to be kind to me. He paused, pensively rubbing his clean-shaven chin with his forefinger. His long profile was turned towards Eve, standing out like brown marble against the gloom of the valley. Eve wondered about this woman, this Rosa, who had been 40 years in her grave. She wondered what manner of woman this must have been to have kept the love of a man through all these years by a mere memory. But she did not wonder that Rosa had been kind. She saw things in me that do not exist, Cipriani de Lloseta went on quietly. It is so with women when, and men may thank God that it is so. He gave a little laugh, unpleasant to the ear, the laugh of a man who has been right down to the bottom of life and comes up again with a sneer. Eve and Fitz made no sign. This story was like wine that has lain forgotten in the dark for many years. It needed careful handling. Henry Cyprian turned on his silken cushion, and opening his great dark eyes, watched the speaker with that infantine steadfastness of gaze which may perchance see more than we suspect. We were married. He paused and gave a jerk of the head towards Palmer behind him to the left, in the cathedral, and were quite happy. At that time the Harringtons were living, or rather staying, in this house with your good father. Neither of you ever saw the Honourable George Harrington. Your loss is infinitesimal. For some reason they began to come to Lloseta a good deal, some reason of Mrs. Harrington's. She was always a singular woman with a reason for all that she did, which I, in my old-fashioned way, do not think good in a woman. She disliked my wife. I could see that through her affectionate ways. I do not know why. Men cannot understand these things. Rosa was very beautiful. Eve, who was watching his face, gave a little nod, a mental nod, as it were, for her own edification. It is possible that she, being a woman, understood. Finally they came to stay a few days. You know the Spanish hospitality. She forced it on us against our will. I was particularly averse to it because of Rosa. I wanted to be quietly at Lloseta. We intended to live almost entirely in Mallorca. We wanted our children to be Mallorcans, and especially a son. The Harringtons stayed longer than we invited them for. They were well-bred adventurers. I have met many such in English country houses, people who shoot and fish and hunt at the expense of others. It suited them to stay at Lloseta, and they did so. They were people who got the best of everything by asking for it, by looking upon it in a well-bred way as their right. I did not mind that, but I wanted them to go on account of Rosa. Also, I disliked the woman's manner toward myself. It altered when Rosa was not there. You understand. We have a word for it in Spain, but I will not say it because the woman is dead. There was a rasping sound as he drew his first and second fingers across his closely shaven chin. It is a singular thing that cynics usually reserve their keenest shafts for women. At last I informed Rosa that they must be told to go, and Rosa was very angry. It was her pride, the pride of a new-fledged hostess, of a young matron. She was Spanish and hot-tempered. My inhospitality was terrible to her, and she spoke sharply. I was quicker to feel and to act then than I am now. I answered her. I would not give way, thinking, as I was, of the son we hoped for. It was nothing but we raised our voices. In the heat of the argument I lifted my hand. Rosa thought that I was going to strike her. A strange mistake. She stepped back and fell. You know our marble floors. She struck her temple against the floor and she lay quite still. I heard a sound and turning saw Mrs. Harrington in the doorway. She had been listening. She had seen everything. Rosa never recovered consciousness. She died. It was terribly easy for her to die. It was equally hard for me to continue living. Mrs. Harrington helped me in my great sorrow to a certain extent, but she would not help me by going away. Then, as soon as Rosa was buried, she told me that unless I gave her money, she would tell all Spain that I had murdered my wife. At first I did not understand. I did not know that God had created women such as this. But she made her meaning quite clear. Indeed, to do this thoroughly, she hinted to the neighbours that she knew more than she had disclosed. All Mallorca would turn its back upon me, all except Challoner. I paid the woman. I have paid her ever since, and I do not regret it. What else could I do? After many generations of honour and uprightness, I could not let the name of Lloseta fall into the hands of a low woman such as Mrs. Harrington. I had to pay heavily, but it was still cheap. I saved the name. No breath of dishonour has reached the name of de Lloseta de Mallorca. I got her out of Mallorca, and my old friend Challoner set himself the task of silencing the gossips. But I found that I had to leave Lloseta. For the name's sake, I quitted my home. He spread out his hands with a patient gesture of resignation. Such has been my life, he went on. It has been spent in preserving the name, unspotted, in paying Mrs. Harrington, and in praying the good God to make her life unhappy and short. In his greater wisdom he prolonged her life, but it was never a happy one, for God is just. I am the last of the Llosetas. The name will die, but it has lived for 600 years, and it dies as it lived, unspotted, one of the great names of the world. He broke off with a little laugh. Spanish pride, he said, I must beg your indulgence. My life, you know, it has not been a happy one. I have never forgotten Rosa. I have never even tried. I have had several objects, however, in life. It has not been uninteresting. One of the chief of these objects has been to repay to a minute extent the true friendship of my dear Challoner. He was a friend in need. He taught me to look upon the English as the finest race of men on this planet. I may be wrong, but I shall adhere to my opinion. In my small way I attempted to repay in part to Challoner's daughter all that I owed to him, but I only ran against a pride as strong, as sensitive as my own. My child, you did quite right. He turned to Eve, smiling his patient smile. And now, he went on, I shall have my way after all. He laid his hand on Henry Cyprian, who was conscientiously putting the Valley of Repose to its best use. After all, this little caballero was born at Deraja. Deraja is his. Is it not so? And Eve, giving up her pride to him, casting it down before his loftier pride, came round to his chair and, bending over, kissed him silently. End of section 30. Recorded by Sandra Cullum. End of The Grey Lady by Henry Seton MERRIMAN.